Hello and welcome. My name is Inge Patsch and welcome to the series The Blind Spots of Economic Theories. Today, Neoliberalism Part 1. I've actually split up this in two parts, as in the first part I will explain very briefly some key assumptions and key theories of neoliberalism, only to then in the second part and also describe what are the blind spots Bernd Senf saw in them. And then in the second part I will actually have a look at neoliberalism from a complexity thinking's point of view. So as I already indicated, this video is based on the book Die blinden Flecken der Ökonomie by Professor Bernd Senf from the University of Berlin. So I've taken many ideas from him and added like my own thought level on this. As always, I begin my series with saying, let's put the setting where we are. So when did this economic thoughts of neoliberalism appear? So we are like in the 1850s, 1910. The population has 1.2 billion, so a bit more live on the planet as nowadays live, for example, in India alone. Light bulb has just been invented, same as telephone or arc welding. So we are like already starting into a new age with a lot of technologies which allow higher communication and so on. One person has shaken society, particular economist, with his thoughts. That has been Karl Marx. And I have made another video about him and his economic theories, where I have been explaining how he shed light on blind spots of economic theories before. So as his viewpoints were actually shaking the society a lot, there seemed to have been a lot of economists coming up at the same time with a counter-argument which takes into consideration the criticism which Marx had, or not, we can see this later. Interestingly, Leon Walras, Stanley Jevons, and Karl Menger from Austria, Stanley Jevons was from the UK and Walras was from France, parallelly came up with some similar idea, which we nowadays consider being the neoclassical idea. And their theoretical house could be said to be standing on three pillars. So the neoliberal theory is standing on the pillar of the entrepreneurial theory, the market theory, and the household theory. And all three theories are like essential for the house to be standing stable. Once like one of the theories is not stable anymore, the actual whole theory building would fall together. What did they do with one of the most critical viewpoints or the critical hypothesis of Karl Marx, namely that added value comes in the end from labor as the only source of added value in a global national economic scale? Well, they simply took out this question from the model. So their model doesn't deal anymore with the macroeconomic question saying what actually causes economic growth, growth of productivity. They simply don't ask this question anymore. And so they became blind in regard of this question, therefore also blind in regard of where Marx saw most conflict. So they made like a clean model which came out without this. Overall, it was a time where clean models, and it was like a fashion to say, okay, economics is a real science such as physics or chemistry, where you can measure everything and you can make 100% experiment, and then everything is like really nice numerical, it can be plotted in charts and so on. And this was also what they did basically. So they came up, for example, with this household theory, and the household theory is saying, okay, there are units of which are consumers. These are the so-called households. And then there are products, and you could use Gosson's law, which was kind of saying for any household, the first piece of bread would create a lot of more utility value, no? So they have the amount of any product, and then you have the utility value here. So one piece of bread creates a lot of utility value. The second still creates some utility value, and then slowly, probably, what do you do with 3 or 4 pieces of bread at once? You cannot consume so much. So slowly the utility value would fade and maybe even go back because you need storage and so on. So this was one of the core of their household theory, saying, okay, there is this utility value in every product which we have, and you can measure this, and they drew all kind of beautiful charts with it. So you could then use a similar chart where you have two products and you see that the utility value of both, there is like a meeting point where you maximize the utility, that you say, okay, I have a certain amount of bread and a certain amount of cheese, and this maximizes the utility, for example. So they tried to map all the supply and demand along this, all the demand along this basic law, and saying, okay, we can calculate this all. And one thing I'm sure most of you have come across is what is also from this theory then is saying, okay, there is something like a demand curve. It could go a bit bent like this or a bit bent like that, but basically there is a demand curve that goes something like that, no? And this also brings me then very briefly to the entrepreneurial market theory, which I'll not talk about so much because the flaw is mainly in the household theory. So the entrepreneurial market theory is simply saying, okay, and then there are suppliers which are like providing or helping households to satisfy their needs, or to make sure that these useful goods are provided. And then there will be somewhere this equilibrium price, because when the price increases, more people are willing to supply a piece of bread, and when the price increases, less people are willing. And then we have this point where actually exactly the number of people who want the bread, or the amounts of people wanted, and the numbers of people, amounts of bread produced meets. So that's very simplified spoken, the supply and demand theory. So where's the flaw in this whole theory now? This theory assumes that in the households there are a few mistakes. First of all, this theory underlooks that a household is like one unit which is equally at any time. So you can have different households, there might be different relationships inside the households, different people living there. So it doesn't say anything about the individual living there and whether an individual needs are covered, or how the dynamics are inside. Is there one decision maker, or are there many decision makers? Neither does it tell anything, are people like reflective enough on their usefulness? If you doubt that, just think about how much or how little we know, for example, about food and how useful it is for us. So whether it's more healthy to eat a cabbage or whether it's more healthy to eat an apple, like we actually don't know it exactly, no, so maybe we can intuitionally, but we don't have a rational knowing about what is more healthy for us to do, no? So this means, like, are people really reflective enough? And many people, I also would doubt saying this is the case, that we are really effective enough saying what is most useful for us, considering all the complexity which is there. And last but not least, it's absolutely blind on the topic of emotions. But before I come to the emotions more, there is one more flaw in their beautiful chart with Gauss's law. The point is, in all of you who are a little bit into science know, whenever you have a chart, you should actually have like a unit among which you can measure this. So in order to that you're able to empirically prove what is going on. The problem is they never really figured out a unit with which we can measure usefulness. I mean, this doesn't make the chart totally nonsense, but it does not actually achieve what they were claiming to be a real science where you can actually measure this. Because if you cannot measure usefulness, how would you actually prove empirically that a chart like this is happening? So there might be some, it's still a good figurative chart, but it doesn't reach where they wanted to go, to being a true science. But let's explore the thing with the emotions a bit more. This man is Erich Fromm. He is one of the biggest psychoanalysts of the 20th century, actually. And he would make the quote saying, in order for this economy to be healthy, emotionally sick people are needed. And he, I think, understood a very clear point, is that consumption is an expression of an... So there is certain consumption which is needed to cover our daily needs, but then much of the consumption which is happening is actually not really covering our needs anymore, but is done out of some kind of compensation for being unhappy. If you're German speaker, I can also highly recommend you to watch a few videos from Gerald Hüther, which are on YouTube, where he also explains very well how the lack of satisfying certain needs we have is reflected in this consumption pattern. Yes, and then there is one more. I mean, there are many critiques of the neoliberal theory. One of my early books I was reading was from Ha-Joon Jang. I hope I have pronounced his name correctly. And it's called Things They Don't Tell You, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And he really highlights, it's very nice to read. It's like small chapters, so you can read single chapters. It's a easy read and a nice introduction to this topic. And there is one quote from this book which I find particularly interesting when talking in the academic sector, where he criticizes how in academia we deal with economics. And he would say, the more detachment from the real world you work, the higher up in the intellectual hierarchy you are. So the more you go away from emotions and that there are other factors influencing the decision, the more you can make this mathematically looking really nice, the higher you actually, like in the publishing rank of economic theories. There is a whole set of thoughts which complexity theory shines in this, but I will make a separate video on this. In brief, just as a teaser, they question the idea of the equilibrium, also the separation of economic phenomena from other things, as well as the homo economicus. But please check out my other video if you would like to know what complexity thinking is saying about neoliberalism. So last but not least, this is the chart I have always in the end. So we can see that neoliberalism has still a lot of blind spots. It has the blind spot of nature, so it doesn't see how actually the growth is causing, which is again correlated with the monetary system. So money is just the means in there. It doesn't have an influence, which Gesell and others also will claim that it's wrong. They're blind on the exploitation things, so apparently also all the things which are related to exploitation, the feminist aspect, the property of land, the psychology of masses. Also, their theory doesn't tell much about the systemic involvement with politics or how politics actually shapes economic and social behavior, or the topic of inflation. So they're don't touch this at all. It's a very narrow, beautiful model, but then it leaves out so many, it makes so many things externalities that eventually it will simply break down. I hope you have enjoyed this video and learned something about neoliberalism and its weak points. Again, tune in for my next video on neoliberalism from a complexity point of view, and thanks for watching.